I've always been kind of a visual thinker. In high school, I fell in love with drawing, and I used to work with pastels. And then a friend of mine in high school had a video camera, and so in an English class, we made a kind of, without knowing it, a kind of experimental narrative. It was just a cobbled together story that we whipped up for a high school project. And so I started to play with the image in high school. And around that same time, I met a man. I grew up in upstate New York, and I met a man named Pete Seeger there, who's a musician. He's probably approaching 95 years old right now. He was a folk, sort of one of the originators of American folk music, and he played the banjo with striking coal miners in the 30s, and he played the banjo with civil rights protesters in the 50s, and played it with anti-Vietnam War protesters in the 70s, and he lives in upstate New York and lives near where I grew up. And I met him and got kind of fascinated in by his work and thinking about his life and the use of culture to intervene in politics, in political conversations. And so when I went to college, that's what I wanted to study, was culture and politics with a focus on music. But there weren't a lot of classes that kind of unpacked music and politics. So I ended up studying media kind of more broadly and politics. And so I made my first film really intentionally in college. And it told the story of my dad and paralleled his life story coming from Peru to end up in the United States. He paralleled that story with the history of the potato, which is a vegetable few people know, had its origins in Peru in the Andes, and through only colonization did it end up eventually in Europe and eventually in North America. And so these two immigrants, the potato and my father, both end up in America, both are transformed. My dad becomes a kind of Peruvian couch potato watching the American television. And so it was an experimental documentary connected to my family. And in terms of my filmmaking, it was a really perfect place to start because the story was so surreal. Telling the story of a vegetable moving through history and then my dad moving through his life, that it forced me to think in a very open way visually. So I used animation, I used some documentary techniques like interview or observation. I also used kind of mockumentary or fake-umentary kind of techniques where I would stage things. I used, within the world of animation, used claymation and 3D. And so the film, if you watch it, it sort of cycles through all these different forms. And, but it all came from like a reflection on what it meant to move across borders, what it meant to transform as you go through that process. And so thinking about those ideas, thinking about my dad's life, forced me to think in this very open way, visually. And in terms of how I learned just the technical, it was just, I taught myself and through my friends. And I've never really worked with film until Sleep Dealer, bizarrely. But for the first maybe 12 years of my work, it was all some version of digital. And it wasn't necessarily by preference, it was more just by access, that was a cheaper way to take risks. And with my first films, especially my early documentaries, the way I would work is, shoot a whole lot, edit and put them together, and then go back and shoot more, and then edit in a very open and exploratory and kind of dynamic way. And so just because film is so expensive, it's like harder to have that kind of dialogue between production and post-production. I think when you're going to work in film, which offers a lot of benefits. I mean, I do think the medium is very beautiful, but I think it also makes a lot of sense to go in with a lot of intentionality and clarity if you're going to work in that medium. And so I primarily work digitally. Even though my interest in immigration started through my dad's story, I personally don't believe that because I'm Peruvian that I have unique access to this material. I really believe that anybody who cares about humanity should care about migration. Anybody who cares about the future of the United States should care about what's happening at the US-Mexico border and what's happening to people who are trying to travel and seek opportunity and seek hope, because the future of, to me, the future of what's going to happen, the reality we're all going to live in, the surveillance we'll all live under, the way that we'll be treated legally, or the rights we'll have, those are all first tested on the border. You know, the surveillance technologies, the ways of legally justifying search and seizure, the entire concept of rights it's first sort of torn apart in the borderlands. And where is the border, right? If you go and look, technically, if you think about it, a border should be a centimeter thick. You know, it's like a border has length, 2,000 miles long, but how much width? It should only be 1 centimeter wide. So where's the border patrol, if it's really to patrol the border, should be standing like right on the line. But that's not what the border patrol does. It's 5 miles inside the interior, 10 miles inside the interior. Now they've defined it's 100 miles inside the interior of any border, land border, and 100 miles of any coastline. So now the Border Patrol has license to basically patrol and kind of based on visual suspicion, stop, search, question the vast majority of the population of the United States, you know? And so anybody who cares about the US should care about the border. Anyone who cares about the future of the world should care about immigration. So the fact that I'm Latino and in terms of blood come from Peru, that was relevant to me in how I started. But now that I've been looking at the questions, I really believe it's something that anybody of any background, you know, should care about. It's urgent material.
Are your nose dirty?
Yeah, so sometimes people ask, you know, why you do science fiction and immigration, or why do science fiction and globalization? And to me, I mean, the answer is no matter, when you engage in imagining the future, whether you know it or not, you're doing economics, you're doing political theory, you're doing demographics. I mean, one way or another, as soon as you create an image of an imaginary future that's coming from your point of view, saying this is how I think Washington, D.C. is going to look like in Minority Report. So Steven Spielberg creates the image of Washington, D.C. with these fat highways and traffic buzzing around and cars that go up buildings. And okay, he's telling us there's been a good investment in public infrastructure and that the traffic is going to flow. And so he's like, whether he knows it or not, he's doing, you know, urban design and talking about government budgets, and whether he knows it or not, you know. And then when we see that there's no Latinos in Minority Report, he's telling us something about his demographic theory. Somehow there must have been an out-migration, you know. And so anyways, to me, when you create the future, no matter what, you're thinking about demographics, politics, economics, always. And so then the question is, well, what do you have to say, you know? And is what you're saying resonant with the reality we live in or not? And so to me, my own personal feeling is that in a lot of science fiction film, because there's an assumption that the future is going to be one where there's going to be things like flying cars and skyscrapers, and there's a need for a big budget to paint the future, to create those images. And because there's a need for the big budget, then you need the star. And America's star system right now is very much focused on white actors and a few sort of black actors that can fund films now. Will Smith, for example. But then those faces become the face of the future, because those actors' bodies can command the budget to create the backdrop, you know. And so you have very few futuristic films that have broadly diverse casts, or where you have non-actors, for example, populating that world. It's always hinged on Will Smith or Tom Cruise wandering through the future. There's a bunch of limitations, on sort of systemic limitations on the way that cinema can imagine the future. And I was very interested in creating a film that confronted all of that took a step outside of the United States and looked at the future from a new angle, that said something different about development, that the future does not mean skyscrapers and flying cars. Wherever there's a skyscraper, there's going to be a hole in the ground where all the steel was dug out of the earth, you know? And that hole in the ground is as futuristic as the skyscraper, right? Wherever, in any future scenario, people are going to be eating, where's the food come from? Who cleans all those skyscrapers? You know, and so I like in Sleep Dealer, one of the pleasures of it to me is that we start in the kind of what would be called a periphery, this little desert village, but it just takes 10 seconds of thought to realize that's actually more futuristic than the cities. In terms of the human experience, the vast expanse of the planet is not urban. People live in cities, but the planet is going to be, agriculture will be, you know, untamed and or out of, you know, will be the hinterlands. The periphery is the center. And so in any case, playing with those ideas and confronting some of those limitations of the genre, that was very exciting for me. Sometimes people ask me, you know, is the film, is it a condemnation of technology? Are you critical of technology? Are you, and to me, what I tried to create in Sleep Dealer is a kind of myth that shows the tense and contradictory experiences and impulses of our globalized and connected society. And what I mean by that is that the characters embody different forms of alienation that the network produces. So Memo, when he's in Mexico and remotely controlling a machine in America, so he's working on a building that he'll never be able to touch or never be able to inhabit, it's the form of ultimate alienated labor, right? It's like building a product you'll never even get to see. On the other hand, the same network is used by Luce to share Memo's stories, and it brings him into contact with somebody who had this, you know, kind of very powerful effect on his life. A new solidarity is born, a new relationship emerges, and there's power found in that. And when the network in all of its transnational tendrils brings people together and unleashes a new dialogue that wouldn't have been possible, then there is hope there, you know, and real power. And so that kind of spectrum of experiences is what the film is meant to capture. And the idea is that what I would consider kind of forces of alienation, like the profit motive, corporate exploitation, militarism, those forces are using the net. But so are everyday people to try to find each other, to try to stay in touch, to maintain loving relationships, to build political solidarities. Those forces are also using the net. And who's going to ultimately win out? And the answer is, I don't know. But I know this is a new battlefield, and I know that things are accelerating. And so Sleep Dealer is a myth that's meant to kind of lay out those complexities and leave you in a little bit of a limbo, you know? Skype and these, you know, the ability to video chat, and that it's becoming more and more ubiquitous and more mobile, so that now we have video chatting on our in our pockets now increasingly. It's fascinating to me. It's something that is kind of referred to or in Sleep Dealer when he has the video connection with his family. I think probably maybe the most interesting thing I could offer is just that another reason that I look at immigration and technology is because if you consider a family that's going through the process of immigration, rarely does the entire family up and move. What you have in recent immigrants are divided families, where one person or two people are here and a bunch of other loved ones are there. And those bonds are very powerful. When I grew up, the only way I knew my grandmother growing up was on the telephone, as she was in Peru and I was here. And so immigrants, because they live in these divided families typically, in the 21st century, are pioneers in terms of using technology to try to stitch the family back together. And so some of the first applications of video conferencing that I saw were in Queens, in Jackson Heights, where you could go into these booths and rent basically a type of Skype system that they rigged up so that family members who were here could talk to their children or their husbands or wives that are back there. And yeah, and so that emotional need to reconnect a family divided by great distance, that emotional need drives immigrants to be pioneers in terms of using cell phones, video connection, money wiring systems, networks for moving home video, all of those types of systems. You know, you see them deployed in immigrant spaces. U.S. and U.S. Mexico is such an interesting place to work and to think because it's the and for one reason is because it's the only pairing where there's a land border between a nation that's kind of considered first world or a hyper-developed economy, and then an economy that's considered third world or developing or global south. But it's the only place where there's that land border between economies that are so distinct. And so you inevitably have a very, very powerful connection there. And through the history of the two countries, that connections manifest in many different ways. But in the past couple decades, the age of globalization, as there's been both advances in technology that help people move, advances in technology that help people communicate, advances in technology that help corporations be more efficient, there's been a kind of depression in Mexico of the wage, of buying power, of the ability to sustain life in the countryside. And so there's inevitably going to be an increased flow of people coming to this economy, which it's ups and downs, yes, but it's a robust economy. And so, and that simple kind of, it's a very simple human fact that if there's an opportunity nearby, I'm going to go move and try to find it. I mean, if they built a wall around Indiana and said to people, you have to stay in Indiana, I mean, people would be jumping it. It's a human, so in any case, but in this age of accelerated migration, somehow there's been this discourse of that immigrants who are crossing borders are illegal, are criminals, are possibly terrorists, are drugs. I mean, and the way they talk about it on the TV is they merge, they say the trafficking of drugs, terrorists, and humans. You know, it's like they just merge it all together as if all three were the same, and it's apples and oranges to me. But in any case, there has been this massive impetus to militarize the border, and in Sleep Dealer that was the concept, and so we designed the walls, and we looked around the world at different security barriers, different walls. We looked at the occupied territories and took a lot of the design elements from there and put them on the U.S.-Mexico border digitally. And now, 6 years later, it's there. They have the double wall now, triple wall in certain parts. And so a lot of the work that we did as kind of conceptual design in Sleep Dealer has been put into reality by the Department of Homeland Security. The U.S.-Mexico border, of course, is thousands of miles long and has great variations, everything from like the local cultures and the landscape, and I mean it's a nation unto itself. To me, the most interesting aspect of it, in terms of its geography and the variance between California and Texas, for example, is the relationship between this imaginary line, which is the border, something that was drawn on a map on this certain parallel, and the land. And that, in Texas, where the imaginary line hits the Rio Grande, there's a kind of, you think that, now it's clear where the border is because it's where the river is. And the river is, you see it, there's the border, it's in the ground. And what was fascinating to me was spending time in El Paso learning the story of the Chamizal, which is a place where the river would flood occasionally, and when it floods, then when it settled, it would be on a new path. And there was this piece of land that sometimes the river would go north of, and so the piece of land would be in Mexico, and then sometimes after a flood, the river would go south, and that same piece of land would be in the U.S. And there was always a fight over, this piece of land and who does it really belong to, because it keeps shifting sides. And I love that story because it just shows that lines that we make up in our minds in ways that we try to have clarity in terms of the national order. That nature and other forces, I would say the human heart and the human desire to migrate is one of those forces. But in just a simple sense, the river can't be controlled, and that it's going to shift here and there constantly. And then there's that story in the El Paso region, and then obviously heading west from there, it's just the architecture of the wall at this point. And there's so many different technological and engineering attempts to control the landscape and to control people and deal with ironies and contradictions, which is they want to control the flow of people but somehow allow animals to migrate. And how do you design a wall that's impermeable to people who are very smart, but then also permeable to water, which is going to need to move during floods, or animals, which are going to need to migrate. And I think from what I've read in fairly neutral sources, it sounds like the idea of building that wall successfully has been a huge challenge and kind of a failure in terms of engineering. That has proven very difficult to do. One of the things a lot of times when you're debating the politics of immigration with somebody who's very hardline against immigration, and if you hear somebody say, hey man, you're racist. You don't want immigrants here because you're racist. You don't like them because they're brown. They say, no, that's not it. Look at the Border Patrol. There's half of the Border Patrol is Hispanic. It ain't about race. And they always use the fact that there's a lot of Hispanic Border Patrol agents as a kind of way to say that it's not about race. But true, that you do have a lot of Latinos participating in the Border Patrol and a lot of Latinos participating in the military. My dad was in the infantry. They tried to send him to Latin America. They wanted him to go to Cuba, but he wouldn't. But it's those flows of people are fascinating to me. And as a storyteller, I'm not interested so much in judging any individual, saying you're good or you're bad or anything. I'm more interested in the complexities and the ironies of all of it. But there's definitely something powerful and ironic and enduring in the United States that it's because it's a global hub, and so people from around the world end up here, and often they come from places where the U.S. has already been. So in the case of my family coming from Peru, they're coming from a place where the United States has always had an impact on the government, has always had a deep impact on the landscape and the economy through mining operations, et cetera. So they're fleeing, in a sense, the effects of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. economic intervention, end up in the U.S. And because they're just trying to navigate possibilities and find some hope and find a living, end up in the Army or end up in the Border Patrol, and end up either trying to keep out the next wave of people or end up perhaps dispatched to the next country whose children will end up back here. And so these types of circular flows of bodies and of power is very interesting to me. And that's sort of the story of Sleep Dealer, where you can imagine that Rudy, the soldier who uproots Memo, in his family's past could have had an experience sort of like Memo's in some one way or another. And it's a sort of a circular dynamic that continues. I mean, I think there's no mistake that the cinema is sort of the last cultural form to become reflective of an experience of a new population. So in a sense, Latinos are an ancient population in the United States. We've been here since before there was a United States. People of Spanish descent, people mixed Spanish and indigenous, have been here forever. But in terms of this number, 50 million people, it's a very young population, and it's a recent explosion to get to that kind of critical mass. And so in terms of cultural expression, it's pretty simple. Like, what do you have? What's easy to access? Easy to access is a box of paints. Easy to access is a pencil to write poems or to write books. I mean, the other art forms are much more accessible. Dance, music. Cinema is where they all come together, where you need to have the kind of skill set of a painter, plus the skill set of a choreographer, plus the skill set of a photographer, plus the skill set of a novelist. Cinema is the chorus of all the other arts. And so just in that sense, a sort of new population, a new human experience, being Latino in America, what does it mean? It's going to be expressed first in those other art forms. And that's what we have. We have writers, we have painters, we have dancers, we have musicians. Cinema, it takes a level, it's expensive, and then it's complex creatively, where you need to just reach a moment where there's enough people who have experience, who have who share a vision, and who can build something together. And reaching that moment, it's like a wave that cracks. I think the Latino community is building up creatively, artistically. There's a lot of forces that I think don't want it to, and so there are walls that we hit. But it's also just a question of time, and building up those skills together, as it is a collective expression. Nice. You know, Latinos, I think we're close to hitting 50 million people in the United States. Does that sound about right to you? Yeah, about 50 million people. And there's, in terms of Latino filmmakers that have access to the cinema, working in fiction, it's kind of one. In terms of U.S. Latino filmmakers, it's Robert Rodriguez, you know, and there's, you know, Gregory Nava can occasionally make a film, but very rarely. There's a bunch of Latin American filmmakers from Mexico and from other parts of Latin America that have access. But US-born Latinos who can speak somehow of this experience of being here, it's kind of insane. It's like the lottery. You have better options of winning the lottery than of becoming a successful Latino filmmaker if you look at the numbers. It's like 50 million people, and there's 1 or 2 people who have access. So there's really, to me, it's an emergency, it's a crisis, it's a nightmare and an opportunity. You know, there's a huge need in every sense for Latinos to be making comedies and love stories and action films, and there, I think, should be parallel to that a critical arm of Latino cinema, as there always has been in Black cinema. You know, that there's been, you know, there's not one thing going on in Black cinema. There's multiple impulses at any given time. And that's what we need. We need to have a cinema that's engaging with the discourse of hate that's put upon Latinos, you know, that's fighting racist images actively. And then we also need a cinema that's playful, and and those two can often be the same thing, you know. So anyways, the need is huge, and the opportunities and challenges are many.